In 1939, as Germany mobilized for war, economic planners presented recommendations for organizing industrial production. Their proposal was straightforward: centralize all war production under single authority with power to allocate resources, set priorities, and coordinate across industries. This was standard practice for modern industrial war. Britain would implement similar centralization within months. America would follow in 1942. German economists showed that decentralized production with competing agencies would create inefficiencies, redundancies, and resource conflicts. They calculated that centralized control could increase output by 30 to 50% without adding new factories. The recommendations were technically sound and uncontroversial among professionals. They were never implemented. Nazi political structure consisted of competing power centers where different officials controlled different aspects of economy. No single authority existed to coordinate production. Creating such authority would require Hitler to choose between competing subordinates, which he consistently refused to do. That decision, to begin industrial war with decentralized production rather than centralized coordination, guaranteed the German war economy would operate far below its potential efficiency for the first 3 years of the conflict. The Nazi regime's political organization made centralized war production institutionally impossible. Multiple agencies controlled different aspects of economy: the 4-year plan under Göring, the Ministry of Armaments, the Economics Ministry, military procurement offices for each service branch, and various party organizations. These entities competed for resources, authority, and Hitler's favor. No mechanism existed to coordinate between them. Economists understood that modern war production requires single authority that can allocate steel to tanks versus ships, prioritize aircraft over ammunition, and coordinate supply chains across industries. Germany had no such authority. Each agency pursued its own priorities. When conflicts arose over resource allocation, resolution required Hitler's personal intervention. Hitler deliberately maintained this system because competing subordinates could not threaten his position. Professional economists recognized this was catastrophically inefficient for war production, but the political system could not be reformed without fundamentally restructuring Nazi governance. Industrial war requires coordination. Nazi political structure prevented coordination. These were incompatible from the beginning. German economic expertise in 1939 was among the world's best. Professional economists understood modern industrial production. They studied other nations' war economies from World War I. They recognized that total war required treating industrial production as a unified system rather than collection of competing enterprises. Their recommendations were specific: create single war production authority with power to allocate all industrial resources, subordinate all competing agencies to this authority, establish production priorities based on military requirements rather than political considerations, coordinate supply chains across industries, and standardize production to reduce inefficiencies. These proposals were presented through official channels with detailed analyses showing projected efficiency gains. The economic logic was sound. Britain and America would implement nearly identical systems. But Germany's recommendations were never adopted because they required political restructuring that Nazi system could not accommodate. The expertise existed. The knowledge existed. The political will to override competing power centers did not exist. Decentralized production created predictable problems immediately. Different agencies ordered similar equipment from same manufacturers, creating production conflicts. Steel allocations went to politically favored projects rather than military priorities. Supply chains were interrupted because no authority coordinated component production. Factories waited for parts while other factories produced components nobody needed. Aircraft production was divided among competing programs with no coordination of engines, airframes, or equipment. Tank production suffered from each service branch ordering different specifications. The inefficiencies were visible to anyone examining the system. Production managers reported them continuously. Economic analysts documented the waste. Professional assessments calculated that Germany was achieving perhaps 60% of potential output from existing industrial capacity due to coordination failures. The system was not producing weapons slowly, it was producing them inefficiently. Factories operated below capacity. Resources were misallocated. Production timelines were extended by administrative delays rather than technical limitations. Everything economists predicted about decentralized production was manifesting as observable reality. Britain faced similar industrial mobilization challenge in 1939–40 but responded differently. British government created Ministry of Supply with authority to coordinate all war production. Single entity controlled resource allocation, set production priorities, and resolved conflicts between competing requirements. The system was not perfect, but it provided coordination that Germany lacked. British production efficiency increased dramatically once centralization was implemented. By 1941, Britain was producing more military equipment than Germany despite having smaller industrial base. German economic intelligence documented this. Reports noted that British centralization was achieving higher output per factory than German decentralized system. Professional economists presented these comparisons with recommendations that Germany adopt similar centralization. The comparisons were acknowledged but changed nothing. British approach required creating authority that could override competing interests. Nazi political structure could not accommodate such authority without threatening the system of competing power centers that maintained Hitler's position. Germany had the industrial capacity to match or exceed British production. It lacked the political ability to organize that capacity efficiently. Germany's early military victories in 1939–41 reduced urgency about production inefficiencies. Campaigns in Poland, France, and early Soviet operations succeeded despite industrial systems problems. Wehrmacht captured enormous quantities of equipment and resources from conquered territories. The immediate military situation did not seem to require addressing economic organization. Political leadership interpreted early victories as validation that existing system worked adequately. Economists and production managers who raised concerns about inefficiencies were told that Germany was winning, which proved the system was functioning. This was dangerous logic. Early victories happened because German forces were fighting enemies who were less prepared, not because German production was efficient. The production inefficiencies were being masked by military success, not eliminated. Professional economic analysis showed that Germany was winning despite production system, not because of it. But the apparent success created political environment where fundamental reform seemed unnecessary. The window for easy reform, before production shortfalls affected operations, was passing while political leadership assumed everything was fine. When America entered the war and mobilized its economy, the contrast with German organization became stark. America created War Production Board with sweeping authority to coordinate all industrial production. Single entity allocated resources, set priorities, standardized designs, and coordinated supply chains. American production increased exponentially once centralization was implemented. By 1943, American output exceeded all Axis powers combined. German intelligence tracked American production figures with growing alarm. The numbers showed what centralized coordination could achieve. America was not producing more because American workers were superior. America was producing more because American economic organization eliminated the coordination failures that plagued German production. Professional German economists presented these comparisons. They calculated that if Germany implemented similar centralization, output could increase dramatically using existing factories and workforce. The analysis was correct. When Germany finally centralized production under Speer in 1942-43, output increased exactly as economists predicted. But by then, years of potential production had been lost. In February 1942, after Armaments Minister Fritz Todt died in plane crash, Hitler appointed Albert Speer as replacement. Speer recognized immediately that decentralized production was catastrophically inefficient. He requested and received authority to centralize armaments production, power that economists had recommended granting someone 3 years earlier. Speer implemented exactly the system economists had proposed: single authority allocating resources, coordinated production priorities, standardized designs, integrated supply chains. German production increased dramatically. Within 18 months, output of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition roughly tripled despite Allied bombing and resource shortages. This proved what economists had argued all along: Germany's industrial capacity was adequate, but organization was preventing that capacity from being used efficiently. The production increases under Speer showed what could have been achieved in 1939 if centralization had been implemented then. But 3 years had been lost. Those 3 years of inefficient production created equipment shortages during the period when Germany might have won through material superiority. By the time production was finally organized efficiently, strategic situation had shifted to where increased output could not change outcomes. Economic historians calculate the cost of delayed centralization by comparing actual German production 1939-42 with projected production if Speer-level efficiency had existed from the beginning. The numbers are staggering. Germany could have produced perhaps 50% more tanks, aircraft, and munitions during 1939-42 using existing factories and workforce simply through better coordination. That equipment would have been available during campaigns in France, Britain, and early Soviet Union, the period when material advantage might have affected outcomes. Instead, German forces fought those campaigns while production system was operating at 60% efficiency. The equipment that was not produced in 1939-42 could not be recovered later. When production finally increased under Speer, strategic situation had changed. Germany was fighting defensive war where increased production prolonged fighting but could not change outcomes. Professional economists who recommended centralization in 1939 understood exactly this problem. Efficient production matters most in war's early phases when material advantage can be decisive. Delayed centralization meant inefficient production during decisive period and efficient production during period when efficiency no longer mattered strategically. Why did Nazi Germany delay centralizing production for 3 years despite professional consensus that centralization was necessary? The answer reveals fundamental dysfunction in Nazi governance. Hitler maintained power through a system of competing subordinates who could not cooperate to threaten him. Creating single authority over war production would empower someone who could potentially challenge Hitler's position. The political system required diffuse authority even though war production required concentrated authority. These requirements were incompatible. Professional economists understood the conflict and presented it to leadership: either centralize production and accept political risk of empowered coordinator, or maintain decentralized control and accept inefficient production. Nazi system chose inefficient production because political survival took priority over military effectiveness. This was not unique to war production, similar patterns appeared across Nazi governance. Rational policy consistently lost to political considerations. The regime maintained itself through dysfunction that prevented subordinates from becoming powerful, and that dysfunction made efficient governance impossible. Germany did not fail to centralize because leaders did not understand economics. Germany failed to centralize because political system could not tolerate the authority structure that efficient production required. German industrial leaders recognized decentralized systems problems immediately and advocated for reform. Major manufacturers requested central coordination to resolve resource conflicts and supply chain problems. Krupp, Daimler-Benz, and other major producers sent representatives to government requesting single authority they could work with rather than multiple competing agencies. Industrial advocacy for centralization was unanimous. Business leaders understood that decentralized system was preventing them from producing efficiently. Their advocacy was ignored for 3 years. The reason was political, not economic. Industrialists wanted efficiency. Nazi political system required inefficiency to maintain power balance. When industrialists explained that current system was preventing maximum production, government response was that political considerations took priority. German industry possessed technical capability and management expertise to produce enormous quantities of war material. That capability could not be applied efficiently because political system prevented the coordination that efficiency required. The industrial expertise existed. The political ability to organize that expertise did not exist until 1942 when crisis finally forced change. German intelligence tracking Soviet production noted disturbing trend by 1942. Soviet Union, despite losing enormous territory and industry to German invasion, was producing military equipment at rates exceeding German output. This seemed impossible given that Germany controlled far more industrial capacity than Soviets retained. The explanation was organizational. Soviet economy was ruthlessly centralized under single authority that allocated resources entirely to military production. Every factory, every resource, every worker was coordinated toward military output. The system was brutal and wasteful of human cost, but it achieved production coordination that Germany lacked. German forces were fighting enemy that was outproducing Germany despite having less industrial capacity. The production differential was not about total resources, it was about organizational efficiency. Soviet centralization was achieving higher output from smaller base than German decentralization achieved from larger base. Professional German economists presented this analysis with renewed urgency for German centralization. By 1942, Germany was finally implementing what economists recommended, but 3 years had been lost when production differential was being established. Speer's production increases after 1942 proved definitively that economists' original recommendations were correct. German output tripled in many categories without adding significant new industrial capacity. The increases came entirely from organizational efficiency, coordinated resource allocation, standardized production, integrated supply chains, and elimination of competing agencies. These were exactly the measures economists recommended in 1939. When finally implemented, they produced exactly the results economists predicted. Professional economic analysis had been accurate. The policy delay had been political. By demonstrating what centralization achieved, Speer reforms highlighted cost of the 3-year delay. Every tank, aircraft, and gun that Speer-era efficiency produced in 1943 could have been produced in 1940 if centralization had been implemented when recommended. The strategic difference was enormous. Equipment produced in 1940 would have been available for campaigns when Germany held initiative. Equipment produced in 1943 arrived when Germany was fighting defensive war. The Speer reforms were vindication of professional economic analysis and indictment of political system that delayed implementing that analysis until too late to affect strategic outcomes. Military economic historians analyzing Germany's war production consistently identify delayed centralization as critical strategic failure. If Speer-level coordination had existed from 1939, Germany would have entered war with production system operating at 80 to 90% efficiency rather than 60%. The additional output during 1939 to 42 would have been substantial. Perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 additional tanks, several thousand additional aircraft, and proportionally more ammunition and equipment. This equipment would have been available during France campaign, Battle of Britain, and early Soviet operations. Would this have changed war's outcome? Germany was still going to face combined industrial capacity of Britain, Soviet Union, and America that exceeded German capacity regardless of organizational efficiency. But the additional equipment during 1939 to 42 might have affected specific operational outcomes during period when Germany held strategic initiative. The counterfactual is not about Germany winning, but about how different early war campaigns might have been with 30 to 40% more equipment. The 3-year delay in centralization was strategic choice with calculable consequences. Professional economists identified correct policy. Political system prevented implementing it until too late. Delayed centralization exemplifies recurring pattern in Nazi strategic decision-making. Political and organizational considerations consistently overrode professional expert advice. Economists correctly identified what modern war production required and recommended appropriate policies. Political system could not implement those policies without restructuring power relationships that maintained regime. Professional expertise lost to political necessity every time. This pattern appears across Nazi governance, military strategy subordinated to ideological goals, economic policy serving political purposes, resource allocation following power relationships rather than rational priorities. Each instance of political override seemed individually manageable. Cumulatively, they created systematic inability to implement professional expertise across entire war effort. The delayed production centralization was simply clearest example of broader dysfunction. Professional knowledge existed but political system prevented applying it. Germany did not lack economic expertise or industrial capability. Germany lacked political structure that could implement rational policy when rational policy conflicted with regime maintenance requirements. The cost was measured in years of inefficient production during period when efficiency mattered most strategically. When Germany surrendered, economic analysis could calculate precise cost of delayed centralization. 3 years of inefficient production, 1939 through 1941, represented approximately 30 to 40% lost output compared to what spear-level coordination would have achieved. That lost production was irrecoverable. Equipment not built in 1940 could not be built retrospectively. Professional economists had identified this problem before war began. They presented solutions that were technically sound and operationally necessary. Solutions were not implemented because Nazi political structure could not accommodate central coordinating authority without threatening regime's power balance. The delay was not technical constraint or resource shortage. The delay was political choice to prioritize regime maintenance over production efficiency. When centralization finally occurred in 1942, it achieved exactly what economists predicted, proving their analysis was correct. But strategic moment had passed. The equipment that efficient production could have provided during 1939 to 42 would have been available when Germany held initiative and when material advantage might have affected operational outcomes. Instead, equipment arrived during defensive period when increased production prolonged fighting but could not change strategic trajectory. Germany did not lose because German industry was inadequate or German economists were incompetent. Germany lost partly because political system prevented implementing professional economic advice during the years when implementation mattered strategically.